Which is the ultimate Dragon Ball games trilogy, Budokai or Budokai Tenkaichi? After all, both are filled with fast-paced combat, over-the-top special moves, and Yamcha being wiped out by Cybermen. Well, in this video we're going to compare both trilogies and see how they stack up against one another in a series of categories. And make sure to stick to the end to find out which trilogy the fandom chose as their favorite. Let's begin by comparing the gameplay mechanics, and this is where the two trilogies have the most difference. The Budokai games are essentially 2D fighters with 3D elements. The series would incorporate more 3D elements as it went on, but the games were primarily presented in a side view perspective with the opponents facing each other at all times. On the other hand, Budokai Tenkaichi is an arena fighter, allowing for much greater freedom of movement across a much larger playing field. The camera is now positioned behind the player, meaning each fighter gets their own field of view. The Tenkaichi games would also rely on a lock-on targeting system, as opponents could easily get lost in large arenas. It really is hard to say which of these is better. I think it's really down to your individual preference. If you're a fan of traditional fighting games, then you'd probably prefer Budokai's side perspective, whilst those looking for an experience closer to the anime might go with the Tenkaichi games. Now, despite their difference in presentation, both trilogies are still Dragon Ball fighting games, so the controls do have elements in common. Characters still dash, fly, punch, kick, and throw ki blasts. Likewise, each character will have their signature moves from the anime. However, the execution of these moves does differ between the two trilogies. The Budokai games, especially the early ones, had the special attacks triggered via a successive button combo. Meanwhile, the Tenkaichi games focused more on pressing a combination of buttons simultaneously. To be fair, Budokai 2 and 3 would simplify many of these combos. However, this in no way meant that the Tenkaichi combat system was simpler or basic compared to Budokai. By the time the trilogies were in their third iterations, both games were filled with all sorts of mechanics, counters, and combat techniques. Both would also rely on the trademark Dragon Ball over-the-top ultimate moves and special attacks. Here are a few comparisons of the same moves.
You are awesome! I can't wait! Later! See you later!
Now, while the Tenkaichi games had these moves presented as passive sequences, the later two Budokai games had a tendency to rely on interactive elements such as button bashing, analog spinning, or just a game of chance. Another key gameplay difference between the two trilogies is the character customization. Budokai relies on the capsule system, where the characters have a limited number of capsule spaces. These capsules range from special moves to transformations to combos to power-ups and even fusion or senzu beans. This forces the player to balance out their character and make sacrifices. For example, fusion will take up the entire board. In the Tenkaichi trilogy, the attacks and special moves are already baked into the characters and their various transformations. So instead, the Z item system focuses on boosting the character's stats and battle attributes. Plus, it does have this password system which allows you to easily port your characters to your friend's game. The Budokai games have something similar, but you will need to use a second memory card. Now, when comparing the overall gameplay between the two series, I would say that the Budokai games were definitely the easier ones to pick up and play, and their controls do feel a bit more intuitive. If you just want to jump in and fight, this is the better trilogy. However, if you're willing to get over the steep learning curve and master Tenkaichi's controls and 3D combat mechanics, you'll be in for a great time. Okay, let's move on to the characters, and if we're comparing the trilogies just based on quantity, then Tenkaichi wins hands down. Tenkaichi 3 has 98 characters, that's 161 if you include all the different forms. Meanwhile, Budokai 3 only has 42. The Tenkaichi games have every Dragon Ball character that you can think of, and then some, like Nam, Nail, Devilman, Frieza Soldier, that hideous thing from one of the movies, and of course Evil Goku from Wish. Now, don't get me wrong, having such a monumental roster of characters is impressive, and I'm sure we've all spent way too much time creating ridiculous mismatched cannon-breaking battles. Just hear me out. Yajirobe versus General Blue in Hell. However, a lot of these characters do kind of feel the same, and once the novelty of having them wears off, you're never really going to play as them. On the other hand, the Budokai Trilogy seems to have more of a focus on quality over quantity. Its smaller roster means the developers were able to spend more time crafting the characters and giving them more of a unique feel. This also means that you can see all the characters and their snazzy alternate costumes in the character select HUD. Okay, moving on, let's take a look at the campaign and the other game modes. And this really is a tough one to compare because both trilogies have really great campaigns. The Budokai Trilogy, having come first, had the burden of trying to figure out how to do justice to Dragon Ball's giant story in a campaign mode. The first game had anime-accurate cutscenes in between the battles. I was actually a big fan of this approach, even if the story only went up to the Cell arc. The second game tried something completely different with its board game style campaign. Meanwhile, Budokai 3 had the characters fly around the overworld exchanging dialogue via static sprites. Now, it's clear that the Tenkaichi developers learnt a lot from the Budokai games when implementing their campaigns. The first game has a pretty linear story mode which covers all of Z, some of GT, and some of the movies. The second game borrows from Budokai 3 with its world map traversal, and then Tenkaichi 3 takes a rather odd step back and returns to the chapter-based approach. Granted, the third game's feature of being able to swap out characters during battle does improve the pacing. Now, if you're looking for the most authentic retelling of the story, I would say the Tenkaichi trilogy is the one to play. Its huge roster of characters allows for the story to include every battle that happened in the anime, and then some. And speaking of which, both trilogies include some fun what-if stories. And while the Tenkaichi games have more actual scenarios to play through, I prefer the ones from the original Budokai because the developers actually went to the effort of animating them in all their bizarre glory. I mean, you don't get any better than Cell absorbing Krillin. Both trilogies also include a bunch of other game modes, from versus to tournament and training to every permutation of special battle that you can think of. But overall, I do think the Tenkaichi trilogy does take this one just because it has a huge variety of different game modes. Plus, it did also have a really comprehensive gallery mode. My favorite is the one from the third game where Chi-Chi will talk trash about each one of the 160 characters in the game.
This is Master Roshi when he's serious. First time I've ever seen this. Hope his pervertedness doesn't power up.
Okay, next up, let's compare the graphics and sound. Now, all 6 of these games were released on the PlayStation 2, so there shouldn't be that much difference, right? Well, one thing to note is that the Budokai Trilogy came out at the start and middle of the console's life cycle, while the Tenkaichi Trilogy was released towards the end. This meant that Dimps were one of the first developers to try and adapt the look of a 2D anime to the 6th generation of consoles, and you can literally see them learn as they go along, starting with the first game's design, then moving to the cel-shaded look, and further refining it by the third entry. By the time the first Tenkaichi game was released in 2005, the anime game look had very much been figured out. However, Spike also deserves some praise for adding their own style to the series and refining it as the trilogy went on. The Tenkaichi character models do look higher in detail than the ones used in Budokai, but personally I have always preferred the design of the Budokai models. They just seem a bit more accurate to the anime. Both trilogies had very similar menu designs filled with all sorts of little details and Easter eggs, but their intro cinematics were very different. Budokai 1 had a 3D reimagining of the original opening. It was pretty cool, but I think Budokai 2 and 3 were the ones that really stood out. Both games had these beautiful original 2D openings that were made legendary thanks to the inclusion of 2 amazing vocal tracks from Hironobu Kageyama himself. Unless you were in America, where he was replaced by a guitar. The Tenkaichi games decided to go for pre-rendered 3D openings, which always felt a bit off to me. In the first one, the characters were all covered in oil, and then they were really stiff looking for the other 2. The first 2 theme songs were also comprised of these forgettable instrumentals. But hey, at least the third one did get a Hironobu Kageyama vocal track. As long as we're being completely subjective about the music, I'm gonna say it. I prefer the original Budokai soundtrack to the one from Tenkaichi. Yes, I know that a lot of these songs were probably plagiarized by the composer, but come on, take one listen to this and tell me it doesn't get you pumped up. And finally, let's talk about the game's legacy and impact. Both trilogies have become fan favorites, but for slightly different reasons. The first three Budokai games set the blueprint for what a 3D Dragon Ball game should be and proved that the franchise could support a fast-paced modern fighter. The Tenkaichi trilogy took those foundations and expanded on them, creating a dynamic arena fighter with a huge roster that for most fans personifies peak Dragon Ball action. So much so that when I asked the community to pick their favorite, 3/4 of them voted for the Tenkaichi trilogy. Which kind of makes sense. Objectively speaking, the Tenkaichi series just has more. More characters, more stages, more modes, more battles, more dimensions. But I still think it's worth acknowledging the foundations laid down by the Budokai games. And I think Yuki Kid said it best in my comment section. Budokai dribbled so Tenkaichi could dunk. But what do you think? Which trilogy do you prefer and why? Please leave a comment below with your take. As always, thanks for watching. Please consider supporting me on Patreon, and a huge thanks to all my existing patrons. Also, if you've enjoyed this video, please remember to like, subscribe, and hit the bell. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.